So I hope you like the Nova documentary, Building the Great Cathedrals. I really liked how it shows different building methods and their labs that they're trying to recreate in France and California, and the problems they created in cathedrals by trying to get higher and higher, and the way they were competing with each other. Really interesting ideas about the mastery of the engineering techniques they used in the Gothic era with the pointed arch, you know, that being the arch that is from Islamic world that we talked about a few times, where it looks like it has the top that's like that rather than the rounded. Also, the way that they talk about flying buttressing, which are these big struts, like a strut on a sculpture. That's like an exoskeleton for the whole building. And then they talked a lot about these interesting ideas. We've already talked about them in chapter 12 a bit, which is like the ribbed arches that they cross over and direct the weight down. We'll talk about and look at some of these in some of the buildings, but that was pretty cool. And then they get into showing you a bit about stained glass making, which I really enjoy, and blowing glass and things like that. We'll talk a tiny bit more about that. But there's a lot of people who still do this type of stuff today. It's pretty cool. And then they got into some ideas about Solomon's Temple, and Nova has a way that they're trying to create extra mystery on things all the time. I don't get too caught up in the number coding, but I do think this is a common thing that happened in buildings. You can see it all the way back into ancient Greece. We talked about how the proportions of the buildings, like the Parthenon, um, were maybe very, very well considered, and that would be easy for us to see how they would do that, referencing famous buildings and the proportions, and then that they would probably look to certain numbers that were trying to pull out of the Bible for that reason, as well as not too far of a stretch of an idea. Nova just maybe overly dramatizes things like that. So we're going to keep going on and looking at some different buildings and also different people who had an impact in the era. One of the people that had an impact in the era is a man named Abbot Sugar. We could say in a way he's the inventor of the Gothic style. Um, he was the abbot of Saint Denis, a special place that was a royal burial site, and he was the first bishop of France. He was well connected to the King of France, and so this is part of why he had such an influential position. He was close to the king and his son, and he even served as a regent while they were away, while one of them was away at the Crusades. So he decided to rebuild this place, Saint Denis, in a style of architecture to reinforce the idea of the divine right of the kings as a political thing, but also to increase this whole environment in the place, this kind of beauty through light and windows, like they've been talking about. Not all the elements that they used were completely new, but they were kind of changed, synthesized. And one of them is one of the ones that is especially new is the flying buttress. But like cross vaulting in the ribs and the rib vaulting, that's not totally new, like I just said a minute ago. He was inspired by the writings of some different people from ancient Greece and different places like that. Um, Dionysus about mathematical harmony and light and the lightness of windows. And he was educated, like I said, with the future king of France, Louis VI. So he had a position of power to be able to pull things off and to change things and create things. So that helped him out a lot too. So let's talk a bit about what it is about this infatuation with light and windows, and also how they made them and why it's such a big deal. So, making stained glass, as they showed you in the documentary that you were watching, it's translucent glass cut from to form a design like this, each section. And the pattern is drawn out on wood or paper, and then they cut the glass. The colored glass they used to make themselves with like a mix of metallic oxides or fusing clear and colored glasses together. Different ones would create different colors, but some of them would create even this different colors from the same oxide depending on the heat you put it to, and other kinds of very chemistry-based things, but also art. This happens in glass making and ceramics. There's kind of this weird and interesting amalgamation of like chemistry and art and how it works together when you have heat on certain type of elements. So they would add the details in a type of black enamel, and then they would bake them in kilns, and then they would join them together, as you can see someone doing here, with strips of lead, and then they're framed by an armature, so the hole around it was like a whole armature, and then they would join that to the building and fasten it into the stone architecture. If you think about it, we're dealing with an era where these very, very, very much are like a multimedia experience of the day, going to a cathedral. And these, why do you say that? We're like, oh, it's just a window colored glass. Well, if you've ever been to a cathedral with these really, really large glass windows like this and daylight streaming into them in this space where it's brightly colored and goes every which direction, even now, as a person in the modern era, these are breathtaking. They're, really amazing in the way the light affects the glass and the color. But you have to imagine you're talking about people who are illiterate, who live in, very, very basic houses with a lot of drab colors. Talking about an era where there's no television, there's no any type of film, there's no photography, there's not even books widely available, and imagery is not widely available to people. So this is quite a revolutionary thing for a lot of them to see something like this. Very, very different from their daily life. And they're very beautiful even now when we have experienced all those things. So you can imagine how this is going to be pretty inspiring. Plus, they're inside these giant buildings that dwarf you as a human. Even now, if you go into a big cathedral, they are giant, giant, giant buildings. Most of us have like 8 to 10 foot ceilings, so imagine these spaces that are 10 to 20 times the size of your room that you're in right now. Going up and up and up and up. And giant, giant, giant buildings, larger than, school auditoriums and things. Huge. With all sorts of detail and artistry in it. Okay? And they have these acoustics with people performing the mass that are bouncing around and giving it a really pretty amazing sound. And there's these beautiful colored lights, and then there's sometimes different candles and smells and different type of things. So this is like a building that really transports you into a different sort of space aesthetically and mentally, and that's part of the point of them, right? So it's very much about an experience of multimedia. What I mean by that, a lot of things at once: sensory, full body immersion, smell, sight, sounds. They're very, very different than the average day for people in this era, and even for us now. So now we're going to look at some examples of some Gothic cathedrals and architecture. Much of this chapter is around about this type of architecture. First, we're going to look at one in Paris, which is the capital of France, most populous city. Since the 17th century, it's a center for finance, commerce, fashion, science, and the arts. It's a really, really large economy for France and one of the largest urban areas in Europe, so really pretty popular and large. Very old city and lots and lots of famous landmarks, like, the Eiffel Tower, different places. A lot of art and culture has come out of here over the years and years and years. We're going to look at this small section of it called the Ile de Cité. It's a natural island in the Seine within the city of Paris. It's in the center of Paris and probably the birthplace of the city. It's naturally defensible, so really basically probably the origin of the city is to have this island that's naturally defensible inside this large river. The West End has a palace since the 5th century over here, and then Palace Dauphine. And over here, we're going to look at this building, Notre Dame, which is on the eastern end of it, consecrated to religious buildings over here. This one did exist up until not that long ago, but is no longer. Notre Dame and Saint-Chapelle are here. The 10th century construction of there was a cathedral before today's Notre Dame, but now no longer today's Notre Dame. Hopefully that's clear. Point is, this half has always kind of been palaces and things, and this half's always been sort of different types of churches. You get to it through various bridges. I've been to it. This is a pretty old photograph, but interesting. The famous one is called the Pont Neuf Bridge. Means new bridge, which is ironic because it's the oldest standing bridge in Paris, but at the time when it was named, it replaced even older bridges. This is like one of the bridges that crosses from the left to the right bank of the city. So if you think about it, we have this giant city with a river running down it. So there's a left bank and a right bank through the whole city. That's an important part of the kind of feeling of the city, these bridges throughout it. And this one stands by the western downstream point of it. It's a pretty cool way to cross over and get to this island. It's pretty amazing. It's made of a lot of arches that are joined together. Pretty cool like that. And we're going to look at a couple details on it as interesting decorations. Very beautiful at night to see the river like this. There's these stone masks all around the outside of it that are like different types of mythological satyrs, different types of field divinities from ancient mythology, personifications of the woods and trees, dryads, all this type of stuff is all over the bridge right there. So it has a like mythological feel to it when you look on the side of it. It's pretty cool. So it has when you cross over, you have a feeling of age already happening. And this is was considered one of the finest examples of French Gothic. As we talked about, Gothic originated in Normandy, France, but spread to other styles around the world, Europe, I should say, and we could talk about it as one of the first international styles beyond just one specific region, but to go across different regions. This was a Catholic cathedral and housed some important relics. A piece of what they called the True Cross, crown of thorns from the crucifixion and holy nail were said to be here. It had the economy of pilgrims, and there was the idea of proselytizing, preaching the faith. And then back in the day, there were many schools associated with cathedrals where the wealthy could send their children to be educated. It was made of stone and stained glass, like most cathedrals. But sadly, this cathedral just went through fire in April of 2019. So last year just had a huge devastation to it. It's going to have to be completely rebuilt. So up until recently, we talked about it as fully existing still for a long, long time. And yeah, just recent destruction is really terrible considering it's from the 1200s and just now it finally had a crazy thing. I don't know exactly, they haven't figured out, I'm sure, or I haven't read about how exactly it started or what happened, but they were able to save a lot of the relics and things as part of it. So that's good. So we'll have to talk about it in the past tense already, which is pretty sad. You can see on it, the outside of it, like the exoskeleton, that's the flying buttresses. These are all flying buttresses. And you can see some of the different things we've seen before, like the front face of it with the two towers. And there's going to be some things we'll see, like rib vaulting that directs the weight down to the piers at the corners. From here you can see that it's not really a full Latin cross. It's more of a long basilica style. It still has the crossing transept, but it's not like a full on Latin cross. It has the giant rose windows that let in a ton of light. This is a common theme in a lot of Gothic cathedrals, And then Notre Dame, meaning Our Lady. Most of these were dedicated to Mary, the mother of Jesus. So it has these really large windows, like all Gothic cathedrals were really well known for this, to let in so much light. And light becomes a symbol for God's presence. And then ton of detail and carving in the architecture on the outside, especially around the triple portal. So this is the entrance to it. The doors being called portals. 3 being a symbol for the Trinity. So Father, Son, and Spirit. In Christianity, we see a lot of 3s on these things. The big rose window, which was about the Mary, the mother of Jesus, but also you have ideas of the big eye, watchful eye of God. People mention that a lot. And there's really this large rib vaulting we'll see in the ceiling that allows them to have a lot more windows, and we'll talk about more of that. But I want to point out right away and show you what we're talking about. These are the pointed arches. This type of shape is the pointed arch. And this is carved into the facade, but we'll see these throughout, these type of things that are part of it. What allowed them to be able to build higher and higher. Because, maybe I can draw it on this here. Yeah, this will work. If you had a line like this, it directs the weight to the ground more quickly to be pointed, okay? And if you would have had a round arch, which I'll try to draw on the screen, it's kind of hard freehand with this mouse situation. Let's say you had a rounder arch like that, not pointed. Then when you direct the weight, the load, which comes down, right, from the top, see how it goes further out? The triangle gets a lot bigger. And so if it doesn't direct as quickly, you have to have a lot more thickness everywhere to hold it up. But if you're able to direct the load to the ground more quickly, you don't need as thick of these big old walls and things to hold it up in place. So that's part of it. And then if you go back to this slide we'll look at, if you remember in our sculpture in different parts of ancient Greece and Rome, we had these struts that people would put to hold the stone in place so it wouldn't break, like the leg of, somebody. One of them we looked at was Augustus, Suprema Porter, with the dolphin on his, and Cupid down there. Well, these are like struts for the building to hold the weight and to be able to have thinner columns, and this allows for all the windows to be there. So these are called flying buttresses because they fly out, and buttress meaning to shore up or make stronger thickening of the walls before was called buttressing as well. So it just basically allows them to have thinner walls and to avoid stress fractures and to have higher spaces that are lighter and more full of glass. On the outside of it, there's a lot of famous statuary. You probably know of the Hunchback of Notre Dame, right? And so there's these, as part of that, this Quasimodo kind of related to these gargoyles that are on the top of it. They're famous for this in this building, and they're actually water spouts also, so that water wouldn't run all over the masonry and it would help preserve it. And they were originally colored, but the paint had gone over the years. They're grotesque in nature, but that's to kind of, you kind of think, oh, why make grotesque things on this building? Well, it's kind of to ward off evil. So we think of them grotesquely. Sometimes we're like, well, they look evil, and it's actually about warding it off, though. So kind of like making things grotesque to keep evil away. That's part of what they're about. So another symbolism we see, circular windows. The idea of circular things throughout is eternity as well. And then you see how there's different things that are interlocking threes. Like I said, that's about the Trinity. And then we'll look at things inside of it where grandeur and light is about the glory of God. And then there's organs with organ music as part of the worship service. But another part of this that was very famous are these bell towers. So Hunchback of Notre Dame is the bell ringer, Victor Hugo's fictional story. So those were famous in Paris. They're bells to call people to mass and markers of time. And we're going to have in here the tympanums, in the middle one, the main portal, the judgment, the last judgment, which we talked a lot about in the Romanesque period as well. And then there's a ton of different types of sculptural figures on the whole thing, which are saints and different people like that. So a lot of this is about the illiterate getting a visual lesson of scripture with sculpture, like we talked about with the tympanum over the door. There's more round windows besides just the ones over here to the side. Transept has some as well, really beautiful windows. And then, of course, as I said before, I keep going back to the wrong slide here. The three doors entering the front of it is also the Trinity as well. So there's a lot of different things that we can kind of pull out from numbers and stuff like that. So that's the portal up here. This also has the Last Judgment. We don't need to go into too much detail about that because I've already talked about that a lot in chapter 12. So you're seeing the outside a lot. And this is just want to show you on the back where the apse is, some of that, the complexity of that exoskeleton of the flying buttresses that's happening all over there. This vaulting, helps hold it all up, basically. The roof in a complex way, but, in a totally way more complex way than we've seen before, to give us these thin columns and bright light able to come through into the whole building. So this is the nave, which is the center aisle, if you remember going down the church, something you need to know. And this shows you that looking upward, the groin vaulting, that holds it up in a complex way than more just before we had like a barrel vault. It just went G. Well, this crossing over makes it a lot stronger. It's crossing over of these Gothic arches, right? And we see those. It just makes the space more beautiful and grand also. So pretty amazing. When you look down this, it's pretty awesome. Can house a lot of people. Paris is a big city, of course, but still, this is very much a sort of place of pilgrimage, and we have a place that can hold a lot of people. Could hold a lot of people. And then there was an upper area, an arcade, for extra people to participate and to be spectators or pilgrims to be involved. So that's interesting. I just want to show you the side view and how there's even threes throughout. Three windows in each one of these within a big one. So that's like the 3-in-1 of the Trinity happening there. So they're being very specific about all their symbolism and the design. And you can see here how that vaulting goes down into the thicker columns there. But they're not just leaving them blank. They're carving relief. You get continuation of all the things we talked about in Greece and Rome. Greece with the Corinthian columns. So I think it's an important idea to think about how art builds upon itself over time, over and over again. It kind of like quotes things from the past, but resynthesizes, makes it new, takes the pieces and changes it up, like we've seen time and again with Greek things and the Romans, how they pulled things from the Greeks, and then the Byzantine Empire pulled things from the Greeks and the Romans, and then the Romanesque pulled things like from them all, including things like the way that they did inlays of ceramic and tile and all these type of things, and each one of them's adding something, but also using a bunch of the things that came before, even the Greeks were using things from the other Aegean cultures and Minoans and changing them. So it's just a continuation over time and building upon it. It's part of art history, really. Pretty beautiful windows throughout this whole space, just show you. We're not going to look at all the details of all of them, but you can see that looking up how much light and colored light they'd be letting in. Okay, moving on to Chartres, also medieval Gothic. Again, just like the last one, was a Roman Catholic church that's burned up sadly, but it was functional and operational as a church. This one also is a cathedral, which is a place of worship, a Catholic church, and also house some of what they call other important relics, a piece of the robe of Mary while giving birth to Jesus. During this period of time, there's a sort of cult around Mary that's very strong. People would call it a cult, adoration of her. So that's something that we notice because a lot of these are all dedicated to her and have a lot of theming around with rose windows and things. This is showing you the floor plan here and also a three-quarter isometric view of the building. That's the facade there. Interesting when you need to recognize this one for a slide. It has two different towers, which we'll talk a bit about. This again has the economy of pilgrims happening. It's made out of stained glass, and some copper. And there's also in these kind of buildings the economy of skilled labor. So what do I mean by that? A cathedral would take sometimes this one was under construction for 86 years. You're like, okay, whatever. Well, that's probably, longer than a lot of people would have lived during this time. And even nowadays, living to be 86 is pretty old. So this would probably take more than the lifetime of a single person to make. If you think about that, it adds a job for people. There could be a person who would have worked on this one project their entire life and been paid for their skilled labor. So that's a huge economic thing for a city. This one does have the ground plane of a Latin cross. You can see the Latin cross there. And again, talking about the large windows that let in so much light. And it's about the same type of symbolisms going on here in a lot of things. Triplicates, large eternity, these large windows to be light, the divine presence of God, and three being three in one, the Trinity, all this type of stuff still happening. You can see the way that they did flying buttressing here, transferring the thrust from downward, the weight is coming down, pushing it to the ground and holding it up. Again, to keep it from stressing out the buildings and breaking them. There's a lot of relief sculpture on this one. And then again, the bells to call people to mass and time. It has some gargoyles on it, but for the same type of purposes, to ward off evil and also to keep the masonry from getting damaged. Really beautiful cathedral, honestly. And this is the west portal, which has some interesting sculpture around it as well. And all of this is about the illiterate getting visual lessons through stained glass and sculpture. There's a lot of blue we're going to see in the stained glass windows. So around these, there's like biblical figures and saints and apostles and things like that carved in detail all around. So a lot of sculpture going on. And we can see kind of some differences in the figuration but there's going to be a lot of blue. I should have said I didn't finish my idea in some of the stained glass windows because Mary's robe while giving birth to Jesus is a relic they have is blue in their relic, so that's part of it, and so it's a symbolism of Mary throughout a lot of the windows. So we'll see a lot of blue in their windows. But let's talk about some of the ideas of figuration that are different in this Gothic era and maybe something like ancient Greece or Rome, you get the same type of feeling of, this is naturalistic, this is anatomically trying to become like realistic, right? So we can see that they're people, they look more or less as people, but there's not that same level of trying to make everything like the musculature perfectly accurate. There's a more of a focus on the spiritual and the symbolic, so bare feet, clothed, obviously a big deal. The stylization on the robes and things are a lot different. It's about kind of a spiritual state, so they sometimes feel more elongated and kind of floating. Very, very much about the symbolism of the type of things they're holding, right? So there's a lot of different stuff going on here that's not exactly the same when we see it throughout the place. So that's something I kind of want to point out right away when we're looking at that stuff. So we have like a feeling that they're not totally anatomically correct. There's zigzagging in the clothing. They have a weightlessness that's purposeful, so their bodies are drawn up. Your eyes drawn up towards the heavens. So there's an idea of that kind of happening because the body is not as important as the soul in this stuff. And in these the door jams, there's the kings and queens of the Old Testament as part of there too. So that's part of this whole scene. And as again, there's like things about the Last Judgment and stuff like that in the school. But I want to go back again for a minute to the facade and just go back and see how it's broken up into thirds and 3 doors. So this whole building is using this symbolism. And there's almost like 3 vertical movements as well. The mismatched towers are visually interesting. And what happened is common in Gothic cathedrals. They would run out of money when they were building it, so their kind of project would maybe have a halt to it. And when they picked it back up again, instead of building the same one, the next tower in exactly the same symmetrically, they would just build it in the new style. Or maybe a tower would fall down on some of them, and instead of rebuilding it to match, they would rebuild it in the new style. So that's kind of a weird thing for us. Like, we would be like, why don't you just make it match? It would look better. But that's the sort of thought process behind that. And you can see sort of the way they made the buttressing thicker here to help hold it up. That's again so that you have the ability to put these giant windows in around it. So really kind of, even though it's mismatched tower, it's still really beautiful there. So I want to say a couple more things about the portals. And I kind of want to point out to you, like, the triumphal arches we saw, how these have a sort of feeling to them like that. There's a square and then there's an entryway. And some of them we looked at, not all of them, some of them were just one big arch, but other ones were like, had a couple openings. And the bigger one's always in the middle. So there's kind of a common theme kind of happening there. There is also this idea of as you enter to the church, there's a prefigure or a reenacting out the idea of what you'll be when you'll enter to heaven. So through the judgment, the last judgment. So they're often on there beyond just being an illustration for the illiterate about what will happen when you die. There's also this idea about you'll be judged before you enter heaven and you die. So it's kind of interesting that's on a door. So the door being the symbol for the cusp from life to death as well. So that's part of it. And then you get these other type of illustrations of people on there who are like Old Testament figures, kings and queens. And there's some also scenes on some of these type of things of the Revelation. So the second coming of Christ is also on some of them. And then you'll often see the 4 evangelists, which we talked about are the writers of the gospel books, and then the 12 apostles will be showing up a lot on some of these So you'll see figures in different, but this kind of common themes we talked about, the difference in the figure is very, very common throughout a lot of Gothic cathedrals that we'll look at. So that's That's something we've seen a lot in even the Romanesque era as well. So this is the nave of Chartres Cathedral, which is that long central aisle looking down it. And it's one of the first examples of what we would call high Gothic. So if it goes along as a style, it got to its like height as a Gothic style. This would be one of the earliest examples of what they would call that. It has still some medieval stained glass in existence today, which is unfortunately more rare than we would like because they break at times. There's a huge verticality to this cathedral, feeling this central space really going up and up and up. And then again, the pointed arches everywhere draw your eye up, but they also do, as I said, carry the weight better. See that? And then the same systems of cross ribs. Faster, the weight can go down more quickly. See how it goes straight into it? Then a rounded arch would have been like, and go further out. And you would require thicker columns on the side, thicker posts, so to speak, compared to post and lintel. So every time they're kind of making it better engineering in those ways. The weight distribution being quicker between the windows. It's 50 feet taller than the St. Foy of the Romanesque era, which is pretty crazy. So really beautiful place. Houses a lot of people. We're talking about the same type of ideas about economy of pilgrimage, extra people coming through here. And these are some of the scenes of these beautiful, beautiful windows. I mean, let in the beautiful colored light. It's pretty gorgeous. This is one of the ones that you'll have to be able to identify. So it's rose window and lancets. These are the lancets right here. This is the rose window. Of course, part of them is they're letting in colored light, right? And as I said before many times, communicating to people who can't read, right? So they would have been able to dissect some of this and understand a bit of it. So we'll talk a bit about that as well. Let's see here. So in the center of it is Mary here and baby Jesus. And around part, there's like all these parts that kind of continue to be symmetrical. Each way you split it, radially symmetrical, of different kind of scenes and things being shown all the way around it. So Mary's at the center and very important to this place. And every one of these little things around is in 12. Okay? So there's 12 of these squares, 12 of these. Why would that be? Well, it's because 12 is the number of tribes of Israel and the number of apostles. So that's a huge part of it for a number for them. So this section here has 4 doves and 8 angels. Then there's coming out further 12 Old Testament kings in the squares. So they're precursors for Christ. They're kind of representational of that. Then we have these lilies of gold and blue, which are a symbol of the French kings, gold lilies on a blue field of fleur-de-lis. So there's very much about France and the place of France and the power of, French kings in France. Then we have further out 12 Old Testament prophets, precursors of the apostles. So precursors of Christ, precursors of the apostles. They care very much about this sort of history that they're showing as part of what they believe about Christ and themselves, right? Their identity is in some way tied up with this by putting the fleur-de-lis on the blue background. Down below, we'll look at some of the lancets in more detail. There's not a lot of awesome pictures of this. Unfortunately, it's hard to find, so some of these are a bit blurrier than I would like. But let's have a look at some of the details in them. So this is also using a lot of typologies and precursors in history in the Bible. The center is Saint Anne, who would be Mary's mother. So Mary, the mother of Jesus, this is her mother, Saint Anne. So that's very much talking about Mary, and this place is important. You notice we have the fleur-de-lis here. So that's, again, tying all this into their identity as French place and French king. On the left is David and then Melchizedek. So throne of David is the ideas of the Messiah. So as in Jesus being a descendant of David, and as a thing that he is the proper and rightful Messiah. And you also have Melchizedek, who is an Old Testament priest, just briefly in the Old Testament, who is also considered to be a typology of Christ, as the New Testament talks about him being the priest, or the one who opens up, is an intermediary between us and God through his sacrifice. So there's a lot of typologies of Christ happening here. And then on the other side over here, we have Solomon, who is the builder of the Old Testament temple that we looked at, where the Wailing Wall was, so the actual site where it was destroyed. So this is the symbolism here of Solomon building the temple has a couple different meanings. One, for them talking about this building as a temple or house for God to worship God in, and also the temple being a place where the Holy of Holies was, where the high priest would go once a year. And there's a way in which they're talking about the way into the Holy of Holies through this place, which brings us to the other idea over here of Aaron, the Old Testament original high priest, Aaron. And so a picture of him is, again, the idea that Jesus is the final high priest, the one who sacrificed himself to make a way to God. So they're using these windows to really talk about the things that they believe about Christ being the Messiah, the one born of a virgin to come and take away sin, and to open up a way to God and to bring life and resurrection. So this is all happening here through these windows. And they're beautiful, and they let in a lot of light to draw people into the message and to make the place, awe-inspiring, basically. So this is it's very much a common thing in Gothic cathedrals. And there's this idea of light, and you can see here how the light would break in, being a really important symbol for them. Bernard of Clairvaux, a clergy who wrote about light, not only as a symbol, but being conducive to prayer and concentration. So there's also this idea of it being helpful for them to be able to pray, and lighting candles is part of that as well. And then we'll have to add in the idea too here of them being a lot of blue, like I said about Mary, but also this circle being the idea of kind of the all-seeing eye of God as part of that. People will often say is associated with that. So they're made out of glass, colored like we've talked about, and I said a lot of them have Mary somewhere in the center, an important part of them, because like Notre Dame, they're dedicated, most all Gothic cathedrals are dedicated to Mary in some way. So this is a huge part of them as well. So let's look at the facade of Rheims Cathedral. It's in France. It's a later French Gothic style. Again, same as the other ones, a place of worship, cathedral, Roman Catholic Cathedral Church. Also has some important relics, and we'll get again the same theme of the economy of the pilgrimages, made of stone. It's a little bit more of a stubby transept on this one than some of the other ones we've seen, which is that crossing aisle. And the chapels radiate further out on it than some of the other ones we've seen. Pretty interesting. It's got elongated sort of verticality to it, which feels really high, pushing up high. And the proportions of the arches are taller and thinner in this one. They're feeling taller than, say, one of our last ones. If I can pull up the slide. See how these are? Ream is getting taller and thinner. Oh, I'm jumping too far ahead here. Sorry. And there's a lot more naturalistic sculpture on here. You can see how these sculptures, the angels sort of turn towards each other in a way, and the robes and the draperies not feeling quite so stylized, like the knees are showing through. there's still a stylization, but they're getting more naturalistic. They're facing each other in places. A lot of the symbolism in this whole building is much like we've talked about before, with sculptural narratives in places and the type of stuff that's happening in the round windows and things like that. This is looking back at the door, the main portal. Look at this rose window. I mean, that is gorgeous. And you can see that taller, thinner arch really here very clearly. It's really, really, really breathtaking. Um, yeah, it's kind of like, even now, this would be the pulpit where the priest would preach or do the mass from. Even now, when you see these places, you think, oh yeah, whatever. If you go into one of these places, they're just a sort of solemn grandeur and kind of amazement when you get into a space this large. That's a door, so, bigger than the average door. They're probably at least 12 feet. See how big this place is? Going up and up and up and up. Reaching for the heavens. I mean, you can literally see it here, like it talks about in that documentary, how they're trying to reach for the heavens. So looking up like that and having this space really brings about that idea. So this sculpture here was about the Annunciation. Gabriel came and told Mary that she was going to be the mother of Jesus, and then she visits her cousin Elizabeth and tells her she's pregnant, and Elizabeth is already pregnant with John the Baptist, so he kind of jumps in her womb. He's going to be one of the prophets right before Christ who says, prepare the way, basically. So that's what's going on there. Let's look at one of the last buildings we're going to look at here. Sainte-Chapelle in Paris also. Medieval Gothic, 13th century. This is known for its transcendent beauty of light in the windows. One of the most beautiful ones is commissioned by King Louis IX. And there's no transept crossing hall, and the walls have become really, really thin with stone, so they're almost like the stone is disappearing into total glass walls. We're going to look at that there, how these are almost fully glass walls. Wow. The ceiling vaults have the same type of things going on, the Gothic arch, the cross ribbon, but they're gold and blue with gold fleur-de-lis, which are, of course, the symbol for the King of France. But also, if we look closer at them, they have some kind of idea of the night sky, right? A blue sky with gold stars can be something about the idea of the heavens and the night sky happening. But I mean, look at this gorgeous light coming in here. And we got this kind of feeling of the lower downs a little darker, but it's got golden decoration, fleur-de-lis, and then as it goes up, it gets brighter, and then there's like the night sky happening. It mirrors the ideas of like the heavenly lights and the lower being darkness or hell. There's kind of some of that going on. And there's sort of an idea here of the end of time and a new heaven and new earth being made with these glorious spaces. So like a remaking, a restoring of creation that's happening in this type of building as a symbolism. They talk a lot about. But look at these walls of glass. I mean, this is a gorgeous, gorgeous building. How can you not see? And that's interesting. There's like a little chapel inside of the chapel. And this is coming up towards the apse. All these details, and there's just so much detail over the whole surface. I mean, it's pretty incredibly made. This is talk about like totally lavish, aesthetically beautiful place to have windows that are basically a whole wall of glass, colored white and glass. I mean, this is a pretty awe-inspiring type of space to be in. So that takes us through chapter 13, which is, and you need to make sure you watch that documentary about building cathedrals, because it's going to give you a lot of interesting insights into them. and most of what we looked at in this chapter have been those type of pieces of architecture, cathedrals and things. So you really do need to know about those. And that takes us through the end of the course as far as lecture. There'll be some documentaries and things. If I need to add any more, I will. But you're going to want to study and read those chapters for this test, 11, 12, and 13. Only have a few more weeks here. So you want to make sure you're watching all those documentaries, engaging with the book, reading the chapters, and using those slide lists and vocab lists to really study in the book. Find the words, be able to define them. That's actually an activity that you need to be doing. I'm not checking on it because it's for your benefit to be able to get the test, but it's considered part of the course. Time and energy that you're spending as part of the interaction is to take that list and read the chapter and find those definitions from the lecture and the chapter for the vocab, and then look at those images in the book and be able to identify them. One of the strategies for me, if I was doing that, is, for example, if I had to know what Sainte-Chapelle looked like, I would think about what makes it stand out the most. If I'm looking at the facade of Chartres, well, that's going to be fairly easy. I'm going to remember it's the one with the two different type of towers in it, right? So you want to kind of look at them and really, when I studied, I go, okay, Chartres Cathedral, medieval Gothic, 1200. I go through, I look at it, and I say those words out loud to myself so I know information about it, and read it and say it out loud at the same time. Those are memorization strategies, and really look at the imagery so you can kind of see what it is about it that's different. Okay? Same with the other sculptures and things from chapter 10 and 11. You want to use those type of memorization ideas and be able to focus in on stuff. So Notre Dame, what's particular about it? Well, you could look at the two big towers, right? The way it's triplicate around, and do the same thing. Notre Dame, Gothic, exact same information. Say it out loud and look at it and read it at the same time. Yeah? So that's going to help you be able to memorize things. All right, if you haven't turned in your papers, you need to do that. You can turn them in until the last regular week of class before finals week, like I said in my announcement. So take advantage of the opportunity. If you're going to lose some points because it's late, but you're not going to be able to pass courses in general in college unless you turn in all your work. So you just need to go about that and get it done. All right, take care, guys. I hope you're staying out of the way of COVID and staying home as much as you can. And it's difficult to stay home when the weather's nice, but to try to continue to be safe out there. Take care.